Clock Tower is a survival horror-adventure video game series created by Hifumi Kono. The series includes 4 games in total. The first entry, Clock Tower, is a survival horror point-and-click adventure game developed and published by Human Entertainment for the Super Famicom in 1995. The story follows Jennifer Simpson, a young girl searching for a way out of a mansion in Norway while evading Scissorman. The game sold well upon release, and has gained the status of a cult classic over the years. An updated version, titled Clock Tower: The First Fear, was ported to the PlayStation, WonderSwan, and Windows. An enhanced, international port of the game, targeting 8th and 9th generation consoles, as well as the PC, is scheduled for an early 2024 release. The second entry in the series, released as Clock Tower 2 in Japan, and Clock Tower Overseas, was released for the PlayStation. The story takes place in Norway and follows a variety of characters as they attempt to survive the return of Scissorman, and uncover the mystery of his seemingly immortal state. The game was commercially successful, selling close to 500,000 copies. The game's director, Hifumi Kono, attributed some of this success to Resident Evil generating interest in horror games and the success of the PlayStation. Critical reviews, however, were mixed. The game's horror atmosphere and storyline were praised, although most other aspects were found to be mediocre. Most of the negative critique was directed towards the game's slow pace, which was compared unfavorably to other PlayStation games of the era, particularly the more action-oriented and fast-paced Resident Evil. These factors influenced some critics to recommend Clock Tower purely for point-and-click adventure fans. It holds a score of 72% on game rankings, which indicates it is regarded more favorably by consumers. Clock Tower 2: The Struggle Within, known in Japan as Clock Tower Ghost Head, is the third entry in the series. Released on the PlayStation, it is the first entry not directed by Kono and is considered a spin-off in Japan, where it was not a numbered release. Kono was asked to make the game, but he felt he was out of material and could not make it. The story follows 17-year-old Alyssa Hale, who suffers from multiple personality disorder, with an alter ego named Mr. Bates. The game was met with negative reviews. Journalists heavily criticized the gameplay, which they found to be poor due to its slow and dated point-and-click interface, as well as its reliance on trial-and-error mechanics. The story was criticized by some but found to be mature and creepy by others. Critics ultimately did not recommend the game, except to those looking for an experience similar to the previous Clock Tower game and those looking for a game that, like a cult film, is flawed conventionally but redeemed by its willingness to stray from the mainstream.
Clock Tower 3 is the 4th installment in the series. After Human Entertainment went out of business in 2000, Sunsoft became the sole owner of the Clock Tower intellectual property. Tomoshi Sadamoto, and Japanese film director Kinji Fukasaku, most known in the West for the dystopian thriller Battle Royale, directed the game. Minami, who previously worked with Fukasaku in Battle Royale, modeled for Alyssa. The plot and characters have very little relation with the previous Clock Tower games. The story follows 14-year-old Alyssa Hamilton, who is part of a family lineage of female warriors who travel through time to defeat evil spirits. Alyssa travels from her time in 2003 London to the 1940s and 1960s in order to defeat these entities and bring peace to troubled souls. Clock Tower 3 is a survival horror game played from a fixed third-person camera perspective in which players control 14-year-old schoolgirl Alyssa Hamilton. Clock Tower 3 is the first game in the series to incorporate direct control over the protagonist, as opposed to the point-and-click gameplay used in the previous games. To progress through the game, the player must find items to unlock new areas, solve puzzles, and flee and hide from the enemies known as subordinates. Throughout each level, the player also encounters the spirits of innocent people slain by the subordinates. These spirits will attack Alyssa if she approaches them. In order to pacify them, an item of sentimental value must be found and returned to the spirit's corpse. Alyssa is given no weaponry during the majority of the game, other than a limited supply of holy water, which can be used to temporarily stun pursuing subordinates. The primary means of eluding subordinates, however, is by hiding. There are multiple hiding points throughout each level, and each one can be used multiple times. However, hiding places are ineffective if they seize Alyssa injure them. Throughout most of the game, Alyssa has a panic meter visible on screen. If she is scared by a subordinate, attacked by a spirit or simply frightened by her surroundings, the meter will begin to rise. If it fills, she enters panic mode. In this state, the screen starts flashing and Alyssa becomes difficult to control and begins stumbling and falling over. She is also unable to use holy water and cannot enter hiding spots. After a few seconds, she will momentarily freeze, covering her ears. Panic mode only lasts for a certain amount of time, and its duration can be reduced by using lavender water. However, if she is hit by a subordinate while in panic mode, she will die instantly. The game received mixed reviews and was a commercial failure, selling considerably less than anticipated. The presentation, writing, and graphics were positively received, with many critics praising the cutscenes and Fukasaku's direction. However, the gameplay received criticism from multiple reviews. More specifically, the boss fights and repetitive hiding and chasing gameplay mechanics were cited as weak, and the game itself was felt to be too short. Cold Fear is centered on Tom Hansen, a member of the United States Coast Guard, who comes to the aid of a Russian whaler in the Bering Strait, and finds a mysterious virus has turned the crew into zombie-like creatures. Discovering the involvement of both the Russian mafia and the CIA, Hansen sets out to ensure the virus doesn't reach land. Cold Fear is a survival horror third-person shooter, played from either a third-person fixed camera perspective, or an over-the-shoulder camera, depending on the player's preferences. The main enemies in the game are Russian mercenaries, and various types of zombie-like creatures known as exos, which are creatures infected by a parasitic organism known as an exocell. Exos include infected mercenaries, exoshades, creatures which can see perfectly in the dark, exospecters, which can turn transparent for brief periods of time, and exomasses, a deformed creature created as a result of a failed experiment. Most infected enemies can be knocked down with 2 or 3 shots, but unless the brain is destroyed, they will not die, and will eventually attack Hansen again. Players can destroy the brain either by shooting enemy in the head, or knocking them down and stomping on their head. If an enemy gets close to Hansen, the player can perform a critical hit by pressing a combination of buttons. All exos carry at least one exocell within them. When the exo is killed, the exocell may emerge and attack Hansen, or, if there are any other dead bodies in the area, infect and reanimate that body. The first half of the game is set on a whaler in the middle of a storm, and the conditions on the deck affect the degree of control the player has over Hansen. As the ship sways continuously from side to side, aiming is made more difficult, although Hansen can grab onto a ledge to steady himself. In some instances, the ship can sway to such a degree that Hansen will slide towards the edge and potentially fall overboard. There are also numerous environmental hazards on the deck which react to the motion of the ship, such as swinging electrical wires and crates hooked up to ropes. Waves crashing onto the ship's deck can also cause Hansen damage. The game also features a resistance gauge, which decreases as the player performs certain actions, such as running. If Hansen falls off the edge of the ship, he can hang onto the side as long as he has resistance left, but if he doesn't climb back aboard quickly enough, he will fall into the ocean. The game does not feature an inventory, and neither health packs nor ammo can be stockpiled. Health packs are used immediately upon collection, and no more ammo can be collected than the capacity of the specific weapon. Players can find ammo and health packs distributed throughout the game at certain locations, and also by looting the bodies of fallen enemies. Cold Fear was first announced at E3 in 2004, when the title was included on a list of upcoming games. According to Sony, the game was set to be published by Namco. On October 6, however, Ubisoft announced they would be publishing the Darkworks developed game in March 2005, for PlayStation 2, Xbox and PC. The game would be Ubisoft's first horror game, and Darkworks' second game, after Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare in 2001. To make the Eastern Spirit roll realistically in the storm, the developers had to write a completely new program. They found that making the ship move was easy, but getting it to respond to storm conditions was much more complex. As such, they created a complete roll editor, called the Darkwave Editor, which allowed them to control the pitch, when the ship moves on the horizontal axis, and the roll, when it moves on the vertical axis, separately. The combination of moving the ship on both axes allowed the developers to create realistic ship movements. This in turn allowed them to time the exact movement of the ship to coincide with what was happening in the game without having to use a cutscene. However, creating such a realistic movement system led to camera problems. According to programmer Claude Levister, early in development,
the camera was constantly going through the walls because of the roll movement, so we had to develop an inertia control system for the camera, just as if a cameraman is using a Steadicam behind the hero.
Another change brought about by the ship's motion was that initially, the movement patterns of inanimate objects on the ship were scripted, but this was later replaced with real physics. The ship's constant movement also impacted character animation. Once the ship's movement reached a certain angle, Hansen and any other characters on deck start to slide, and have to compensate in whatever direction was necessary relative to their position. According to Levister, this meant Hansen required 9 times the animations usually seen in third-person games: center, front, back, left, right and 4 intermediary positions. Ultimately, Hansen had 250 separate animations, and most of the non-player characters had 150. According to Antonin Delboy, lead animator on the game,
all the technical decisions were taken in favor of animation, both in terms of quality and quantity, which is very rare on this kind of project.
Basic animation was produced with 3D Studio Max software. Inverse kinematics were then used to create the 9 directional animations, with the engine calculating the level of character compensation depending on the angle of the ship. Each character movement is composed of basic animation and compensation animation, and Delboy says that in total, the game contains more than 900 animations, allowing for over 5,000 possible movements. Levister stated,
"The interaction between the storm and the characters that are on the deck sometimes creates some really breathtaking moments, and on top of that, we managed to offer some really intense action sequences featuring far more enemies than in most horror games."
Cold Fear was met with mixed reviews, with many critics comparing it unfavorably to Resident Evil 4. Although critics were generally impressed with the environments and the opening scenes, they found the game too short and felt it failed to live up to its promising beginning.